In the quiet corners of history, whispered tales speak of a shadow that falls upon unsuspecting communities. These are not stories of grand battles or royal decrees, but of a creeping dread that seeps into homes, one victim at a time. The accounts, scattered across centuries and continents, share a disturbing consistency, painting a chilling portrait of an unseen predator. It often begins subtly, with a profound sense of exhaustion. Individuals once hale and hearty find themselves overcome by a lethargy that sleep cannot cure. They awaken more tired than when they went to bed, their limbs heavy as lead, their vitality draining away like sand through an hourglass. This unexplained fatigue is frequently accompanied by a noticeable change in appearance. The skin, once flushed with life, becomes unnaturally pale, almost translucent. A gauntness sets in, hollowing out the cheeks and sinking the eyes deep into their sockets. Family members and neighbors would remark on the rapid decline, noting how the victim seems to fade before their very eyes, becoming a mere specter of their former self. This physical wasting is often paired with a loss of appetite. The most tempting meals, the most fragrant breads and savory stews, are met with indifference or even revulsion. The afflicted individual turns away from sustenance, their body seemingly rejecting the very things it needs to survive. As the physical body weakens, the mind becomes a playground for torment. The nights, once a time for rest, transform into a period of intense and terrifying dreams. Victims report recurring nightmares of a suffocating presence, a heavy weight pressing down upon their chest, pinning them to their beds. They feel a chilling breath on their neck, a sense of being watched from the darkest corner of the room. In these night terrors, a figure often emerges, sometimes a shadowy form, other times a face they almost recognize, perhaps a recently deceased neighbor or a mysterious stranger seen only in passing. The dream is always the same, a feeling of paralysis, of being utterly helpless as this entity leans in close, its intentions terrifyingly unclear, yet deeply malevolent. They struggle to scream, to move, but their bodies are frozen, trapped in a waking nightmare. Upon waking, drenched in a cold sweat, the terror does not always recede with the dawn. The memory of the dream lingers, a persistent echo of fear. And then they might discover the mark, a small, almost insignificant blemish on the skin, typically on the neck, shoulder, or wrist. At first it might be dismissed as an insect bite or a simple scratch, but these marks are peculiar. They often appear as two small, precise punctures close together. They do not itch or swell in the usual way. Instead, they remain a faint, discolored pair of dots that refuse to heal. Sometimes a single pinprick is found, a subtle testament to the nocturnal visit. Days or weeks later, a new set of marks might appear nearby, a horrifying sign that the visitor has returned. With each passing night, the victim's condition worsens. The pallor deepens, the weakness intensifies. Their behavior becomes erratic. They may grow reclusive, shunning daylight and seeking the dim, quiet solitude of their homes. A strange aversion to once cherished objects can develop. They might recoil from religious symbols, turning their face away from a crucifix or a holy book as if it caused them physical pain. Sunlight itself becomes an enemy, its rays feeling like a searing burn upon their increasingly sensitive skin. They complain of a constant gnawing thirst that no amount of water can quench, a deep internal craving for something they cannot name. The psychological toll is immense. Friends and family watch as their loved one becomes withdrawn, melancholic, and paranoid. The victim may speak in hushed, fearful tones of the nightly visitor, their stories dismissed as fever-induced delusions. Yet, the accounts from different households, sometimes separated by miles and with no contact, share unnerving similarities. A mother in one village describes her son's nightmares of a suffocating shadow, while a farmer miles away reports the same dream, the same paralysis, the same sense of a presence feeding on his very life force. The pattern repeats with a terrifying regularity. In some historical records, witnesses describe a peculiar aroma that hangs in the air around the afflicted person's room. A cloying, earthy scent, like that of freshly turned grave soil mixed with something faintly metallic. It's a smell that clings to the bed linens and curtains, a scent that seems to intensify after dusk. This olfactory clue is another piece of the puzzle, another sign that something unnatural has intruded upon the mortal world. The household pets, too, seem to sense the presence. Dogs that once slept peacefully at the foot of the bed now refuse to enter the room, whining and growling at the doorway. Cats hiss at unseen corners, their fur on end, their eyes wide with fear. The animals know. As the victim nears their end, a strange phenomenon is sometimes observed. Their teeth, particularly the canines, may appear more prominent, sharper, as if their gums were receding around them. Their fingernails might take on a curved claw-like appearance. These subtle changes add to the growing horror, suggesting a slow, terrible transformation. The person is no longer just fading away. They are becoming something else. Their voice may change, growing deeper, raspier, and they might develop an unsettling, penetrating gaze that makes others profoundly uncomfortable. It's a slow, methodical process of draining life. Not a swift, violent end, but a gradual consumption of vitality, of spirit, of the very essence of the person. Each symptom is a step on a dark path. The initial lethargy gives way to wasting. The wasting is punctuated by terrifying dreams. The dreams are validated by physical marks, and the marks are a promise of the visitor's return. This cycle of feeding continues night after night until the victim has nothing left to give. They become a hollow shell, their blood thinned, their spirit extinguished, and the horror does not always end with their final breath. The chronicles speak of what happens next. The community, gripped by fear and suspicion, begins to look back. They recall the first victim, and then the second, and then the third, and a chilling pattern emerges. The sickness spreads not like a common plague, carried on the wind or in the water, but person by person, house by house, often starting with the family of the recently deceased. The newly buried are often the first to be suspected. Whispers turn to accusations, and fear drives communities to take desperate measures, trying to sever the chain of predation and end the nightmare that has befallen them. The signs were all there, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to an unthinkable truth. The exhaustion, the pallor, the dreams, the marks, all pieces of an ancient and terrifying puzzle, a warning passed down through generations in hushed and fearful tones. Throughout history, humanity has been haunted by shadows. In the darkest corners of our collective fear, a creature has endured for centuries, its name whispered in terror, from the rugged mountains of the Balkans to the misty fields of Western Europe. This is not the suave, romantic figure of modern fiction. This is the story of the original vampire, a creature born from plague, superstition, and the chilling reality of death in a world before science. Our journey begins not in a Transylvanian castle, but in the humble villages of Eastern Europe. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a wave of panic swept across the continent. Reports emerged from remote communities in Serbia, Prussia, and Silesia, describing a horrifying phenomenon. The dead were not staying dead. They were returning from their graves, gaunt and bloated, to prey upon the living, draining their life force and spreading a mysterious sickness that baffled local physicians. One of the most infamous cases is that of Petar Blagojević from the Serbian village of Kisiljevo in 1725. After his sudden death, 9 other villagers fell ill and died within a week. On their deathbeds, they claimed Blagojević had returned from the grave to throttle them in their sleep. The terrified villagers, against the orders of local officials, decided to take matters into their own hands. They demanded the exhumation of Petar's body. What they found, according to the official report filed by an Austrian imperial officer, was beyond terrifying. The report, a chilling historical document, states that Blagojević's body showed no signs of decomposition after weeks in the ground. His hair and nails had apparently grown, his eyes were open, and fresh blood was found on his lips. The villagers, convinced he was a vampire, took a sharpened stake and drove it through his heart. The report claims that as the stake pierced his chest, a great quantity of fresh blood erupted from his mouth and ears, and the body let out a terrifying groan. They then burned the corpse to ash and the mysterious deaths in the village ceased. This was not an isolated incident. Just a few years later, the case of Arnold Pale, another Serbian soldier, sparked an even wider investigation. After his death from a fall, a similar wave of sickness and death plagued his community. The locals believed Powell had been tormented by a vampire during his military service and had become one himself. His body was exhumed and displayed the same disturbing characteristics, undecayed, with fresh blood on his lips. He too was staked and burned. However, the curse didn't end. Years later, a new wave of deaths began, attributed to the victims of Powell, who had now become vampires themselves. This second outbreak prompted a formal military investigation by the Habsburg monarchy. Surgeons and officers were dispatched to the village of Medveja. Their detailed report, titled Visum et Repertum, or Seen and Reported, was circulated throughout Europe. It described the exhumation of over a dozen bodies, all in a similar state of preservation, which were subsequently staked and burned. This document, filled with grisly medical details, was not folklore. It was an official military report, and it lent a terrifying air of credibility to the vampire panic. But what were these people actually seeing? Was Europe truly infested with the undead? The truth, as is often the case, is a complex mix of social psychology, misunderstanding of natural processes, and the devastating impact of disease, or so the official theory says. We must remember this was a time before modern medicine. The process of decomposition was poorly understood. Natural phenomena like the bloating of a corpse due to gases, the sloughing of skin that made nails and hair appear longer, or the purging of dark blood-like fluid from the mouth were all interpreted through the lens of superstition. Furthermore, these vampire panics often coincided with outbreaks of very real diseases, like rabies or tuberculosis, which was then known as consumption. The symptoms of consumption, pale skin, coughing up blood, a slow wasting away, created a haunting parallel to the vampire myth. The idea that someone might awaken in their own coffin, clawing at the lid, provided a gruesome foundation for the belief that the dead could, and did, return. The scratches found inside coffins, the bodies in contorted positions, these were not signs of the undead, but of a horrifying death for the living. These fears gave rise to a grim set of rituals. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered deviant burials, meant to prevent the dead from returning. Skeletons have been found with sickles placed across their necks, a primitive form of decapitation should they try to rise. Others were buried face down, so they would dig deeper into the earth. Many were found with large stones placed in their mouths to prevent them from feeding, or with stakes driven through their torsos, pinning them to the earth. These graves are a silent, powerful testament to the genuine terror these communities felt. From the Slavic vampire and the Greek vrikolikas to the German Nachtseher, nearly every European culture had its own version of the life-draining dead. They were not charming aristocrats, they were grotesque, reanimated corpses, often bloated and shrouded in their burial linens, reeking of the grave. They were a physical manifestation of the fear of disease, the unknown nature of death, and the lingering presence of the deceased in the minds of the living. It was only with the dawn of the Enlightenment and the advancement of science that the vampire panic began to recede. But the creature itself did not disappear. It retreated from the village graveyard and into the pages of literature. Many notable writers wrote of both fiction and real accounts of vampire sightings. In the 19th century, writers like John Polidori and Bram Stoker took the raw, terrifying elements of these folk beliefs and refined them, creating the charismatic, aristocratic vampire we know today. Count Dracula is a literary descendant of Peter Blagojevich and Arnold Paole, but he is a world away from the bloated, shambling corpses that haunted Serbian villages. The history of the European vampire is a powerful reminder of how fear and a lack of understanding can shape reality. It shows us a world grappling with death in the most visceral way imaginable. The stakes, the garlic, the exhumations. These were not theatrical gestures. They were desperate measures taken by people who truly believed they were fighting a war against their own dead. Look to the history, to the shallow graves and the panicked villages, and you will find a story far more chilling and far more human than any fiction. Across cultures and continents, whispers of blood-drinking entities persist, but beyond the simple act of feeding, there are darker, more unsettling legends, tales of intricate blood, rituals and offerings, not just for survival but for power, for appeasement, for communion with something ancient and terrifying. These aren't just campfire stories. They are echoes in our history, etched into folklore and, some believe, into the very stones of our oldest ruins. What if the legends of vampires are not just about a lone predator, but about a cult, a pact, a dark religion built on the currency of life itself? One of the most enduring and disturbing legends comes from the rugged Carpathian Mountains, a region long considered the cradle of vampire lore. Here, old tales speak of a pact between certain noble families and a primordial, blood-hungry entity. It wasn't about a single immortal count, but a lineage sworn to a dark covenant. Local folklore describes a ritual known as the Crimson Tithe. Every generation the family was required to offer a pure blood vessel, not for the entity to feed upon, but to spill their lifeblood onto an ancient, unhallowed altar, hidden deep within their castle's catacombs. It was believed this offering didn't just sustain the entity, it renewed the family's wealth, health, and influence. The price for worldly power was a recurring ritual of sacrifice, a debt paid in blood. Historians dismiss these as folk tales used to explain the rise and fall of aristocratic dynasties, but local whispers persist. They point to genealogies where certain branches of a family tree just end. Young, healthy individuals recorded as dying from sudden illness or unfortunate accidents, their deaths uncannily coinciding with periods of renewed prosperity for their house. This idea of a ritualistic offering rather than a simple feeding is not unique to Eastern Europe. Travel to the sun-scorched earth of ancient Mesopotamia, and you find cuneiform tablets describing the Akaru, a vampiric spirit. Priests of forgotten gods wrote of appeasement rituals required to keep these phantoms at bay. Clay bowls filled with the blood of sacrificed animals, and in darker texts, human captives, were to be left at the crossroads on a new moon. The texts are chillingly specific. The blood was not to be consumed directly, but was to evaporate as a pleasing mist to the entity, a spiritual offering to sate its otherworldly thirst, and prevent it from preying on the living. Archaeologists have, in fact, unearthed ceremonial bowls at ancient Mesopotamian crossroads, their interiors stained with a dark organic residue. While most scholars attribute these to standard animal sacrifices for various deities, the specific placement and the cryptic texts associated with the Akaru offer a more sinister interpretation. Was this just religious practice, or was it a protection racket on a supernatural scale? Let's move forward in time to the 17th century and the infamous case of the Bloody Countess, Elizabeth Bathory. While she is historically documented as a serial killer, the legends surrounding her have taken on a distinctly vampiric hue. The popular story is that she bathed in the blood of young women to retain her youth, but lesser-known folklore surrounding her case speaks of something far more ritualistic. It's said she wasn't merely bathing, but was following a rite prescribed in a grimoire, a dark book of spells allegedly gifted to her family centuries prior. This ritual, it was whispered, didn't just preserve youth, it was an attempt to achieve true immortality, to transcend the human form and become something more. The sheer number of her victims, estimated to be in the hundreds, seems to defy simple vanity. It suggests a methodical, obsessive, and ritualistic practice. Was Bathory simply a monstrously cruel aristocrat, or was she an acolyte in a dark faith, performing a ghastly sacrament in the desperate hope of attaining a vampire's eternal life? The lines blur between historical atrocity and occult legend. Perhaps the most compelling and tangible piece of this puzzle lies not in Europe, but in the jungles of Central America. The Mayan civilization practiced ritual bloodletting, a well-documented historical fact. Rulers and priests would perforate their own bodies to offer blood to the gods, believing it a conduit to the supernatural world. But there are specific glyphs that speak of the Camazots, the death bat, a terrifying underworld deity. Some interpretations of these hieroglyphs suggest that certain bloodletting rituals were not for the traditional pantheon of gods, but were offering specifically to appease this dark, winged creature. In a newly discovered temple complex in Guatemala, archaeologists found a hidden chamber behind the main altar. The walls are covered not in images of feathered serpents or sun gods, but in depictions of monstrous, man-sized bats descending upon priests who are willingly offering their own blood. In the center of the room, a stone basin showed traces of human hemoglobin, carbon dated to the time the temple was active. Mainstream archaeology interprets this as a shrine to a fearsome aspect of their cosmology, but others ask a more unsettling question. Were the Mayans simply worshipping a god, or were they feeding a very real creature that they deified out of terror? A creature that demanded a regular ritual offering to keep it from emerging from the underworld and preying upon them all. These legends, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all point to a similar disturbing pattern. From the crimson tithe of the Carpathians to the Mesopotamian crossroads offerings, from Bathory's grotesque sacrament to the Mayan priests placating the Camazots, the theme isn't just about a monster that needs to eat. It's about a transaction, a pact. It suggests a form of intelligence, a being that can be bargained with, appeased, or even worshipped. This transforms the vampire from a simple beast into a dark god, a creature that understands human desire for power, longevity, and security, and is willing to grant it for a price. The evidence is circumstantial, open to interpretation. The stained bowls, the suspicious genealogies, the cryptic glyphs, they can all be explained away through conventional history and archaeology. But when pieced together, they paint a shadow history of humanity, a history where for millennia we have been leaving offerings in the dark, hoping that whatever lurks there will accept our tribute and leave us in peace. It forces us to reconsider the myth. The greatest horror may not be that vampires exist to hunt us, but that they exist, and for centuries we may have been willingly inviting them in, one bloody ritual at a time. The question remains, have these rituals ever truly stopped? In the shadowy corners of history, where folklore and fear intertwine, lurk tales not of the monsters themselves, but of those who dared to hunt them. Long before cinema glamorized the vampire, a very real and terrifying belief in the undead gripped communities, giving rise to a grim profession, the vampire hunter. These were not caped crusaders, but ordinary people driven by terror and conviction, armed with specialized knowledge passed down through hushed whispers and grim experience. Their stories, often ending in mystery, paint a chilling picture of a world where the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin. One of the most significant figures to chronicle this dark pursuit was not a hunter himself, but a Benedictine monk named Antoine Augustin Calmet. In the 18th century, Calmet penned his Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants, a comprehensive, albeit skeptical, collection of accounts from across Europe. He meticulously documented reports of exhumed bodies found incorrupt with fresh blood at their lips, and the subsequent panic that ensued. Calmet's work, while attempting to debunk the phenomenon, inadvertently created a handbook for future generations, codifying the very beliefs he questioned and giving a scholarly weight to the terrifying figure of the vampire. He documented the methods, the rituals, and the sheer dread that fueled the hunt. So, how did one hunt a creature of the night? It was a task that required more than just courage. It demanded a specific, almost ritualistic set of tools and knowledge. The iconic wooden stake was paramount, but the type of wood was crucial. Depending on the region, only stakes carved from ash, hawthorn, or aspen were believed to be effective. Ash, with its roots in ancient European mythology as a protective tree, was a common choice. Hawthorn, associated with purity and the supernatural, was another. Aspen was thought to be the wood of the cross, imbuing it with holy power. The stake had to be sharp, and the blow precise, aimed directly at the heart to pin the creature to its coffin, forever immobilizing it. but a stake was a last resort. Detection was the first and most critical step. Hunters relied on a variety of methods to identify a vampire's grave. One peculiar belief involved leading a virgin boy on a virgin stallion through a graveyard. It was said the horse would refuse to walk over the grave of a vampire. Another method was to observe the ground for small, unexplained holes, believed to be breathing holes for the undead creature resting below. Strange occurrences like livestock mysteriously sickening or a lingering fog settling over a specific plot were also seen as telltale signs of a vampire's lair. Beyond wood, metal played a vital role in the hunter's arsenal. Silver, long believed to have purifying properties, was considered anathema to the undead. Bullets could be cast from silver, or silver knives could be used to inflict wounds that would not heal. Iron, too, was a powerful deterrent. Placing iron scythes or sickles around a suspected grave was thought to create a barrier the creature could not cross. It was believed that these metals, forged in the earth and by human hands, held a natural power that repelled the unnatural corruption of the vampire. Holy water, salt, and garlic were not just folklore flourishes. They were standard-issue tools used to create protective circles and to test for a vampiric presence. The hunt itself was a grim affair, often performed under the cloak of secrecy. A typical hunt would involve a small group, usually including a priest and a local official, proceeding to the cemetery after dark. Once a grave was identified, the arduous process of exhumation began. This was the moment of truth. If the body was found in a state of natural decay, the matter was closed. But if the corpse was unnaturally preserved, plump with rosy skin, hair, and nails that appeared to have grown, and most damningly fresh blood on its lips, the diagnosis was confirmed. The prescribed remedies were brutal. Decapitation was common, often with a gravedigger's spade. The head would then be placed between the corpse's legs or buried far away to prevent it from reattaching. Filling the mouth with garlic or a brick was another method, intended to stop the creature from feeding should it ever rise again. And of course, the stake through the heart was the final definitive act. As the belief in vampires waned with the rise of scientific understanding, the figure of the vampire hunter transformed. In the 19th century, this grim reality morphed into a subject of morbid fascination. This era gave birth to the vampire hunting kit. These elaborate boxes, often presented as authentic antiques, contained everything a gentleman hunter might need: a pistol with silver bullets, a crucifix, a bottle for holy water, a mallet and stakes, and even a copy of the Book of Common Prayer. While most historians today believe these kits were novelties, created to capitalize on the Gothic horror craze sparked by writers like Bram Stoker, they speak volumes about the enduring power of the legend. They are a tangible link to a time when the threat felt real enough to warrant a dedicated and deadly toolkit. Yet not all tales of vampire hunters are so neatly packaged. The historical record is littered with unsettling accounts of those who went hunting and never returned. In one rural French village in the late 17th century, a man known only as Jean claimed to have tracked a creature responsible for draining his livestock. He boasted of his knowledge, his hawthorn stakes, and his iron charms. Armed and determined, he set off into the woods one evening, telling the villagers he would return with the monster's head. He was never seen again. A search party found only his discarded satchel and a single splintered stake lying near a cave entrance that locals had always avoided. Had he fallen victim to a common predator, or did he find the entity he was seeking? The village's records offer no answer, only an enduring, cautionary tale. Another story from the German countryside speaks of two brothers, both former soldiers, who became convinced that a local aristocrat, recently deceased under mysterious circumstances, was a vampire. They spoke of the nobleman's unnatural pallor in life and his reclusive, nocturnal habits. Following the old ways, they exhumed the body and, finding it incorrupt, performed the grim ritual of staking and decapitation. But their story doesn't end in triumph. Days later, one brother was found dead in his bed, his face a mask of terror, with two small, inexplicable marks on his neck. The other brother descended into madness, raving about a shadowy figure that haunted his nights, a figure that looked exactly like the nobleman they had supposedly destroyed. He vanished from his locked room weeks later, leaving the local authorities baffled and the townsfolk terrified that the curse had not been broken, but merely passed on. The mysterious illnesses and disappearances can be attributed to disease, animal attacks, or simply the dangers of a pre-modern world. And yet, the sheer consistency of these tales across different cultures and centuries gives one pause. The detailed rituals, the specific tools, the accounts of hunters who faced something they could not explain. It all paints a portrait of a genuine, deeply held belief. Perhaps the vampire was never a physical creature of flesh and blood, but a manifestation of humanity's deepest fears. Fear of death, fear of disease, and fear of the unknown that lurks just beyond the firelight. The vampire hunter, then, was not just fighting a monster. They were fighting fear itself. They were individuals who stood on the precipice between the known world and the terrifying possibilities of the dark, armed with wood, iron, and conviction. Whether their prey was real or imagined, their courage, and their often unsettling fate, remains a chilling chapter in our history. Their tales linger, a whisper from the past reminding us that for some, the hunt was very, very real. Have you ever felt a chill in the dead of night? A primal fear that something ancient and unseen is watching? Across the continent, they were known by many names, each whispered with a unique dread. In the rugged lands of Romania, they spoke of the strigoi. The strigoi could be living or dead. Living strigoi were sorcerers, born with a caul or an extra nipple, destined to rise after death. The undead strigoi were the true nightmare. Reanimated corpses that would torment their own families, drain the life from livestock, and spread sickness through the community. They were said to possess the ability to transform into animals, becoming invisible to stalk their prey under the cloak of night. Villagers would take great precautions, sometimes staking the deceased through the heart or placing garlic in their mouths, desperate to ensure the dead remained dead. Further east, among the Slavic peoples, a similar horror was known as the upir, or upia. The upir was notoriously ravenous, its hunger insatiable. Unlike other legends, the upir often began its reign of terror by preying on its own relatives, starting with children and spouses before moving on to the wider village. Chronicles from the era describe them as having a ruddy, bloated appearance, their bodies gorged on the life they had stolen. Their teeth were said to be like iron, capable of tearing through flesh and bone. To stop an upir, one had to find its grave, often identified by a small, mysterious hole in the earth, and perform a specific gruesome ritual, often involving decapitation and filling the mouth with holy objects. In Greece, the fear took the form of the vrikolekas. This creature was not necessarily malicious at first. Often it was the corpse of someone who had lived a sinful life or whose death was improper. Perhaps they were excommunicated or buried in unconsecrated ground. The vrikolakas would rise from its grave and wander the towns, knocking on the doors of its former loved ones. Answering the door meant death would visit that house within days. These beings didn't always drink blood. Their very presence was a blight, bringing pestilence and misfortune. They were described as undecayed, their bodies pliable and warm as if still alive. Stopping a vrikolakas was a community affair, requiring the corpse to be exhumed and either cremated or subjected to the rites of the church to finally grant it peace. Even in the verdant fields of Poland, the shadow of the vampire loomed. Here they were sometimes called the wampirs. Legends of the wampirs are particularly ancient, with some accounts suggesting they slept during the day and hunted at night, their strength immense. They were recognized by their swarthy complexions and prominent teeth. Interestingly, some Polish folklore tells of individuals born to be vampires who could, for a time, live among normal people, their true nature hidden until death unlocked their curse. Once risen, they were a plague upon the living, their thirst unquenchable. To combat them, people would bury suspected wampirs face down, believing it would confuse the spirit and cause it to claw deeper into the earth instead of rising. So where did these stories come from? Were they simply the product of a superstitious age, a way to explain the unexplainable like disease and sudden death? Or is there something more, skeletons found with sickles placed across their necks, presumably to decapitate them if they tried to rise. Others are found with heavy stones pinning them down, or with bricks forced into their mouths. One particularly famous find in Venice revealed a 16th century female skull with a brick wedged between its jaws, a common practice for neutralizing a suspected plague spreader or vampire. Why go to such lengths? Why did entire communities, separated by mountains and languages, independently develop such specific and brutal rituals to deal with the same perceived threat? These archaeological discoveries are not just folklore. They are the physical remnants of a deep-seated, tangible fear. These people weren't just telling stories. They were taking action, performing desperate acts to protect themselves from something they truly believed was real. Could it be that we have dismissed these tales too easily? Perhaps in our modern enlightened world, we've lost touch with a truth our ancestors knew intimately. The line between myth and reality can be a blurry one, shrouded in the mists of time. While we may never know for certain if the Strigoi, the Upir, or the Vrikolakas truly walked the earth, the graves of those they feared remain. They are a silent, chilling testament to a time when humanity believed, with every fiber of its being, that the dead did not always rest in peace. The next time you hear an unexplained noise in the dark, or feel that cold sense of being watched, remember these old tales. Remember the precautions taken, the rituals performed, and the very real fear that inspired them, because the truth behind the legend of the vampire might be far stranger and far more unsettling than we can possibly imagine. There are the stories of cursed bloodlines, generations stalked by a presence that defies simple explanation, a presence whispered to be vampiric. Our journey begins not in the well-trodden paths of Eastern Europe, but in the rugged, wind-swept landscapes of the British Isles during the 12th century. The chronicler William of Newburgh, a man known for his skepticism, documented a series of perplexing events in the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. He wrote of a wealthy but wicked man who, after his death, began to rise from his grave at night. He was seen prowling the streets, his spectral form accompanied by a pack of baying hounds, spreading a pestilence that claimed many lives. The terrified townsfolk reported that the man's corpse remained strangely incorrupt, his cheeks rosy as if he were merely sleeping. Was this a mere local superstition, or was William of Newburgh documenting the first stirrings of a familial curse, a stain that would pass down through unseen generations? The records fall silent, leaving us to wonder what became of his lineage. Let's move forward several centuries to the sun-drenched coast of Rhode Island in the late 1800s. Here, the story of the Brown family unfolds, a tragedy that became a cornerstone of New England's vampire panic. The family was ravaged by consumption, the dreaded tuberculosis. First, the mother, Mary, passed away. Then, her eldest daughter, Mary Olive. Soon after, another daughter, Mercy Lena, also succumbed. The father, George Brown, watched in horror as his son Edwin grew weaker and weaker, wasting away before his eyes. The community, steeped in old-world folklore, began to murmur. They believed that one of the deceased family members was not truly at rest. They whispered that one of them was a vampire, draining the life force from the surviving Edwin. Driven by desperation, George Brown consented to the unthinkable. On a bleak March morning in 1892, a group of villagers exhumed the bodies of his wife and daughters. The first two were decomposed as expected, but when they opened Mercy's coffin, they found her body almost perfectly preserved. Her cheeks held a hint of color, and her heart and liver were found to contain clotted, liquid blood. To the villagers, this was irrefutable proof. They performed a ritual, burning her heart and liver and feeding the ashes to the ailing Edwin. The act was meant to break the curse, to sever the unholy tie that bound the dead to the living. But the question remains, what did they truly find in that coffin? A supernatural predator? Or simply the bizarre, unpredictable nature of decomposition in a cold New England winter? The ritual, tragically, did not save Edwin. He died 2 months later. The Brown family line, once prosperous, was nearly extinguished. leaving behind a chilling legacy of fear and a story that blurs the line between disease and the demonic. Was it a plague of the body or a plague of the bloodline? Similar patterns emerge when we cross the Atlantic to rural France. In the Auvergne region, a land of ancient volcanoes and deep-rooted traditions, tales persisted of the revenants. These weren't just random spirits, they were often members of specific families, said to return from the grave to torment their own kin. One 17th century account speaks of the Alari family. For 3 generations, the firstborn son of each branch of the family would inexplicably fall ill around their 30th birthday. They would grow pale, weak, and suffer from terrifying nightmares, describing a shadowy figure, often a long-dead ancestor, visiting them at night. The local priest dismissed it as a hereditary malady, a sickness of the blood. But the family believed otherwise. They spoke of a pact made by their forefather, a soldier who, in a moment of battlefield desperation, had supposedly drunk the blood of a fallen enemy to survive. They believed this act had tainted their entire lineage, inviting a thirst that echoed down through the years. No official records corroborate the pact, of course. It exists only in oral tradition, passed down in hushed tones, but the consistent tragic pattern of death in the family is documented in parish records, a string of early graves that defy easy medical explanation for the time. Was it a genetic flaw or a spiritual debt coming due? The evidence is circumstantial, yet the story's persistence suggests a deep-seated fear that some curses are carried not in the mind, but in the very blood that flows through our veins. These accounts, separated by centuries and geography, share unsettling similarities. They often begin with a source, an individual whose death is unusual or whose life was marked by transgression. Then a wasting sickness afflicts the family, a consumption that medicine of the day cannot explain or cure. The core of the legend, however, is the physical evidence, the exhumed body that appears unnaturally preserved, with signs of what is interpreted as lingering life. Today we have scientific explanations for these phenomena: anaerobic bacteria, soil conditions, and the varied rates of decomposition. But to a desperate family watching their loved ones fade away, these rationales offer little comfort. When they saw a departed relative looking more alive than their dying child, they didn't see science. They saw a monster. They saw a predator who was once family. What's most disturbing about these bloodline curses is the intimacy of the horror. The threat isn't a monster lurking in a faraway castle. It's a grandmother, a brother, a daughter. The entity is intertwined with the family's own identity and history. This raises a terrifying question. If such things are real, is the curse a spiritual attachment, or is it something passed down through the blood itself? A dormant trait that awakens under certain conditions? The lines between ghost, vampire, and hereditary illness become terrifyingly blurred. The families themselves become living ghost stories, forever looking over their shoulders, wondering if the next cough or pale complexion is a common cold or the awakening of the ancient family shadow. These stories are more than just macabre folklore. They are monuments to human fear in the face of the unknown. They represent our struggle to find patterns in chaos, to name the nameless dread that comes with inexplicable loss. Whether the Browns of Rhode Island or the Alaries of France were haunted by a literal vampire, or by the specter of disease and grief, is a question we can never definitively answer. The evidence is just compelling enough to sow doubt, just vague enough to allow the mystery to endure. And so these tales of cursed bloodlines remain, whispering to us from the annals of history, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who share our name. Stay curious and perhaps keep a watchful eye on your own family tree. You never know what secrets might be hiding in its branches. Throughout the early modern period, tales of the undead were a rural phenomenon, whispered in hushed tones in hamlets and farming villages across Europe. These creatures, born from the earth of lonely graveyards, were often depicted as crude, shambling things. They were simple peasants in life, and in death they remained bound to their local communities, preying on the neighbors and family they once knew. Their methods were unsophisticated, driven by a raw, primal hunger. They would rise from their graves, drawn to the familiar warmth of their former homes, often appearing to loved ones in dreams or as terrifying apparitions before their physical assault. The isolation of these rural communities was both a hunting ground and a prison for these early vampires. News traveled slowly, if at all. A mysterious, wasting sickness that afflicted a family or a strange blight on livestock might be attributed to divine punishment or witchcraft long before the suspicion of a vampiric presence arose. This allowed the creature to feed, sometimes for months, before the community, steeped in folklore and terror, would finally act. Yet this very isolation also contained the threat. The vampire was a local problem. Its influence rarely spread beyond the valley or the few villages it could reach in a single night's journey. It was a monster of the soil, tied to its grave and the people it knew in life. But as the centuries turned, a transformation began. The world was changing. The Industrial Revolution was stirring, and with it, the mass migration of people from the countryside to the burgeoning cities. For the vampire, this was a pivotal moment. The old ways of hiding in plain sight among a small, superstitious populace were becoming increasingly risky. The rise of literacy, the slow march of science, and the increasing interconnectedness of the world meant that a local problem could quickly become a regional panic. The era of the rustic, shambling corpse was drawing to a close. A new breed of predator was emerging, one that understood the changing currents of human society. These more cunning, more intelligent vampires recognized that the greatest camouflage was not the darkness of a rural night, but the blinding light of high society. They began to shed their provincial skins, abandoning the graveyards of their former lives for the sprawling, anonymous labyrinths of London, Paris, and Vienna. In these teeming metropolises, a single death, or even a dozen, was easily lost in the noise of a million lives. The city was a smorgasbord, a place of infinite choice and, more importantly, infinite anonymity. The transition was not merely geographical, it was a complete reinvention of their identity. They learned to mimic the living with flawless precision. They adopted the fashions, the manners, and the speech of the aristocracy. Money, accumulated over lifetimes of illicit gains, or through the careful manipulation of mortal agents, became their most powerful tool. With wealth, they could purchase influence, silence questions, and construct elaborate histories for themselves. A mysterious count from a far-off land, an eccentric baron with nocturnal habits. These were figures of intrigue, not suspicion, within the circles of the nouveau riche and the ancient nobility. The grand balls and salons of the 18th and 19th centuries became their new hunting grounds. Here, amidst the glitter of chandeliers and the rustle of silk, they could move with an elegance that disarmed their prey. They were charismatic, educated, and exuded an exotic charm that mortals found irresistible. They were the ultimate insiders, hiding not in the shadows of alleys, but in the shadows of power and privilege. A young debutante fainting from the heat of the ballroom, an artist wasting away from a poetic consumption. These tragedies were commonplace, romanticized even. No one would suspect the handsome, brooding gentleman who had danced with her just hours before. This infiltration of the upper echelons provided more than just a ready supply of victims. It offered protection. They could influence law enforcement, direct investigations away from themselves, and use their social standing as an unassailable alibi. Who would dare to question a duke or a celebrated industrialist based on the superstitious ramblings of a servant? They created networks, not of fellow vampires, but of mortals ensnared by their wealth, power, and hypnotic charisma. These pawns, lawyers, doctors, politicians, became their daytime guardians, managing their affairs and ensuring their secrets remained buried. The vampire no longer needed to fear the pitchforks of angry villagers. The new threat was the inquiring mind, the dogged journalist, the nascent detective. By embedding themselves within the very fabric of the ruling class, they could monitor and neutralize these threats before they even materialized. They played the long game, understanding that true power was not in brute force, but in subtle manipulation. They could start a rumor that would ruin an investigator's career, fund a scientific endeavor that would lead public opinion down a false path, or simply use their immense wealth to make a problem disappear. They learned to use the tools of modernity against humanity itself. The advent of the telegram and the railway, which once threatened to expose them, now allowed them to move and communicate with unprecedented speed. A vampire could feed in Vienna one night and be seen at the London Opera the next, creating a timeline that defied logic and frustrated any potential pursuit. They owned shipping lines, investing in the very vessels that could transport their coffins, filled with their native soil, across oceans, allowing them to expand their influence to the New World and the farthest corners of the colonial empires. The anonymity of the city was their greatest shield. In a rural village, every face was known, every absence noted. In a metropolis like New York or Berlin, one could disappear without a trace. They could maintain multiple residences, multiple identities, living parallel lives that never intersected. They were the reclusive investor in a downtown skyscraper, the bohemian patron of the arts in a fashionable quarter, the silent partner in a powerful law firm. They were ghosts in the machine of civilization, their presence felt only in the faintest of whispers, in the unexplained tragedies that dotted the society pages, and in the lingering cold spots within the warmest, most crowded rooms. They mastered the art of being unseen while standing in the center of the stage. They learned that the most impenetrable crypt was not one made of stone and earth, but one constructed from wealth influence, and the willing ignorance of a society too dazzled by the glamour of the light to notice the predators thriving just beyond its edge. In the gilded halls of the late 19th century, where new money clashed with old, a figure of impeccable taste and quiet influence began to make his presence known. He arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. His name passed from one influential host to another like a treasured secret. His fortune, seemingly endless, was old, rooted in lands and ventures no one could quite trace. He sponsored the arts, frequented the opera, and held soirée in his lavishly appointed manor on the edge of the city, a residence that was both a beacon of high culture and a fortress of solitude. His charm was his most potent weapon. It was not the boisterous charisma of a politician, but a subtle, magnetic pull. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant murmur that commanded attention without ever raising its volume. He had a way of looking at a person, a deep, penetrating gaze that made them feel as though they were the only soul in a crowded ballroom. This was the first thread in his web. He didn't need to chase. He made them want to be caught. His targets were rarely the darlings of the social season, the debutantes whose absence would be immediately noted and investigated. Instead, he was drawn to the periphery of the elite circle, the visiting cousin from a lesser-known family, the artist whose talent outshone their connections, the widow whose mourning had isolated her from the social whirl. These were individuals whose disappearance might be explained away, a sudden departure, a return to a distant home, a quiet retreat from a world they never truly belonged to. Seduction was an art he had perfected over centuries. It began with an invitation, not to a grand ball, but to a private viewing of a new painting in his collection, or a late-night stroll through his moonlit gardens. He would speak of poetry, of forgotten histories, of a yearning for a connection that transcended the fleeting pleasantries of society. He offered not just passion, but understanding. He mirrored their loneliness, their feeling of being an outsider, and presented himself as the ultimate kindred spirit. He made them feel seen, truly and completely, for the first time. The courtship was a masterful performance of patience, a shared look across a crowded room, a gloved hand held a moment too long, a whispered compliment that lingered in the air like expensive perfume. He would learn their desires, their secret sadness, their deepest aspirations. He became their confidant, their confessor. The physical intimacy, when it came, felt like an inevitable, almost sacred conclusion to this profound emotional bond. They would offer themselves to him willingly, not in fear, but in ecstatic surrender, believing they had found a love that was timeless. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. For those he deemed less suitable for this elaborate dance, a different fate awaited. the city's underbelly provided a different kind of hunting ground. The lost, the desperate, the ones who lived in the shadows just as he did. A young man down on his luck offered a position as a groundskeeper. A girl with no family promised a role as a chambermaid. The advertisements were discreet, the interviews brief, the promises of shelter and sustenance too good to refuse. They would arrive at the manor, their meager belongings in hand, and pass through its heavy iron gates. They would never pass back out. Deep within the sprawling cellars of the estate, far from the opulent ballrooms and art galleries, was a different kind of residence. Not a dungeon of chains and despair, but a series of simple, comfortable rooms. It was a bizarre parody of domesticity. The inhabitants were well fed, clothed, and cared for. They were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They were livestock. He saw it as a more efficient, more humane method. Why risk the unpredictability of the nightly hunt when one could cultivate a private, sustainable source? These guests lived in a state of perpetual twilight, their days and nights blurring into one. They were attended to by silent, unnervingly loyal staff who were themselves bound to the master in ways no employment contract could ever specify. The residents' health was paramount. Their diets were carefully managed, their anxieties soothed with laudanum-laced wines. They were kept placid, docile, and most importantly, healthy. Occasionally, one of the manor's permanent residents would be brought upstairs. Dressed in fine, albeit slightly outdated clothes, they would be seated in a quiet parlor. The master would join them, not as a predator, but as a host. He would speak to them gently, perhaps read to them from a book of verse. It was a ritual. He believed in treating his sustenance with a degree of respect, a perverse form of gratitude. The bite itself was almost an afterthought, a quiet, painless drawing off of life, leaving the subject weak and anemic but alive. They would be returned to their rooms to recover, to replenish, under the watchful eyes of the staff, until they were needed again. He walked a razor's edge. The world of high society was a stage, and he was its most accomplished actor. He hosted senators and industrialists discussing politics and finance with an insight that seemed almost prescient. He donated to charities, funding orphanages and hospitals with a detachment that bordered on irony. He was a pillar of the community, a patron of progress, a man of exquisite taste and deep pockets. He was admired, envied, and desired. But as the carriages departed his manor in the pre-dawn hours, leaving him in the silence of his grand home, the performance would end. The mask of the charming philanthropist would fall away. He would descend the stone steps to the cellars, not with the predatory hunger of a beast, but with the measured gait of a farmer tending his flock. He moved through a world of his own making, a gilded cage built upon secrets and sustained by blood, utterly alone and utterly in control. The night was his kingdom, and in it he was both shepherd and wolf. His greatest performance was not convincing others he was human, but convincing himself that this curated existence, this endless, meticulous management of life and death, was a form of living at all. The cycle was perfect, sustainable, and eternal, and with each sunrise that forced him into the shadows, he knew it was a cycle that would never be broken. Some letters, exchanged between two sisters in Lyon, France in 1768, detail a growing dread that settled over their village. One writes, "Another has been taken, just last night, found in the morning, pale as the moon, with but 2 small marks upon her throat, like a viper's bite, but with no venom, no swelling, only an absence, an emptiness." The local physician was baffled. He noted in his own journal, "The subject is not merely deceased. She is hollowed. It is as though the very life force, the vital spark, has been siphoned away, leaving behind a beautiful but empty vessel." This account was not isolated. Similar reports began to surface across the French countryside, whispers carried by travelers and merchants. In Dorset, England, in the early 1800s, a farmer named Thomas Colmer documented a series of unnerving events in his daily ledger. What began as notes about livestock, found drained and lifeless in their pens, soon turned to matters of human tragedy. He writes, "My neighbor, John, a man of robust health, has taken to his bed. His wife says he suffers from a wasting sickness, yet he eats heartily. But with each passing night he grows paler, weaker. He speaks of a nightly visitor, a shadow with eyes like embers that stands by his bedside. He says he feels a sharp sting in his neck, followed by a profound peace, and then nothing. He wakes more tired than when he fell asleep. Within a fortnight, John was dead. The cause of death was listed as consumption, but Comer's private writings suggest a darker suspicion. It is not a disease of the lungs, he wrote. It is a disease of the soul, drawn out from the body under the cloak of darkness. The testimony of a French Benedictine monk, Brother Mathieu, dating from 1789, provides one of the most chillingly detailed encounters. Tasked with tending to the abbey's remote vineyards, he often worked late into the twilight hours. In a letter to his abbot, he described being watched. "For a week," he wrote, "I have felt eyes upon me from the ancient woods that border our lands. At first I dismissed it as a wolf or a wild boar, but last night it showed itself. It was not a beast, Father. It had the shape of a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in finery that seemed centuries out of fashion. It did not walk, but glided over the uneven ground. Its face was a mask of nobility and hunger, and its eyes held a terrible ancient intelligence." Mathieu claimed the figure spoke to him without moving its lips, a voice that echoed directly in his mind, promising an end to toil and suffering, an eternity of quiet, moonlit existence. The monk fled back to the abbey, barricading himself in the chapel until sunrise. He refused to return to the vineyards, and his subsequent letters are filled with frantic prayers and sketches of a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes. Back in England, the diary of a young London socialite, Miss Eleanor Vance, reveals a different kind of encounter in 1842. She writes of a mysterious gentleman who appeared at a society ball, a man no one seemed to know. "He was captivating," she wrote. "He possessed a grace and charm that put every other man in the room to shame. His name, he said, was Lord Alistair. His skin was like porcelain, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to contain the night sky itself. He spoke of art, of history, of philosophy, as if he had lived through the ages he described." Eleanor became infatuated, meeting him for clandestine walks in the city's moonlit gardens, but her entries grow more troubled. "I am always so tired now. My governess fusses over my pallor, but I feel a strange euphoria when I am with him. Last night as we parted he held my hand, and his touch was as cold as marble. He leaned close, and for a moment I felt a sharp prick at my collarbone, like a misplaced pin. He apologized profusely, and I thought nothing of it. But this morning the mark remains, 2 tiny, perfect red dots." Her diary entries become shorter, the handwriting more erratic. Her final entry simply reads, "Alistair promises forever, the sun hurts my eyes. I long for the night." After that, the diary ends. Eleanor Vance simply vanished from London society. Her family claimed she had been sent to the country for her health, but she was never seen again. This pattern of a charismatic, often aristocratic stranger appearing in a community, followed by a mysterious wasting sickness, is a recurring theme. A constable's report from a small parish near Rouen in France, dated 1815, investigates the deaths of 3 young women in as many months. All were known for their beauty and vitality. All wasted away, complaining of nightmares and a nightly pressure on their chests. The constable, a man of logic and reason, noted with frustration, "There are no signs of struggle, no poison, no discernible malady known to medicine. The only commonality is that all 3 were seen in the weeks prior to their illness in the company of a foreign count who had briefly rented the old chateau on the hill. The count is now gone, having left as suddenly as he arrived. The investigation was closed, the deaths attributed to a fever of unknown origin. But the whispers in the village told a different story. They spoke of the le faim noble, the noble hunger, a creature that fed not on food, but on the life of the young and beautiful. In the archives of the Bishop of Bath and Wells in England, a collection of letters from 1795 details a similar phenomenon. A village priest writes to his superior in a state of panic. "The affliction continues," he pleads. It takes the strongest first, the young men who work the quarries, the robust lasses from the farms. They are found in their beds, having passed peacefully, the coroner says, but they are cold, white, and empty. Their families speak of nightmares, of a dark shape leaning over them. One boy, before he succumbed, swore he was visited by a woman of impossible beauty, with hair as black as a raven's wing and a touch as cold as the grave. He said she whispered secrets of the ages in his ear while he felt his strength ebb away. The priest begs for relics, for rites of exorcism, for anything to combat what he calls a pestilence of the spirit, a shadow that drinks the light from our people. The bishop's response is one of stern caution, advising the priest to avoid stoking local superstitions and to focus on prayer and conventional medicine. But the deaths continued until one day they simply stopped. The local legend claims the creature, having exhausted the local supply of vitality, simply moved on to new hunting grounds. These oral histories and written testimonies from the 18th and 19th centuries paint a consistent and deeply disturbing picture. They are not tales of rampaging monsters, but of subtle, insidious predators. They are stories of a chilling seduction, of a slow, almost peaceful draining of life, disguised as illness or melancholy. From the French vineyards to the drawing rooms of London, the accounts describe a being that is both terrifying and alluring, a creature that moves on the fringes of society, a noble hunter whose prey is humanity itself. The evidence is not in bones or fossils, but in the faded ink of diaries, in the fearful whispers passed down through generations, a chilling chronicle of encounters with a darkness that wore a human face. In a letter from a French doctor to a colleague in 1780, he writes of a patient, a young woman who died from a mysterious anemia. "It is as if a leak has been sprung in the vessel of her life," he writes, "and every night a little more of her essence trickled out. She spoke of a handsome visitor in her dreams, a man who promised her an eternal, dreamless sleep. I am a man of science, but I must confess, as I stood over her pale form, I felt as though I was not in the presence of death by natural causes, but of a harvest." The supernatural fiends are said by different sources to have many powers. One such diabolical power is that of oniric intrusion. This is the ability to invade and manipulate the dreams of mortals. Far from the romantic notion of a lover visiting in slumber, this was a tool of psychological warfare. Vampires gifted with this ability could weave nightmares so vivid, so deeply personal, that their victims would slowly descend into madness. They would project images of lost loved ones turning against them, or manifest their deepest fears in the theater of their minds. A victim might awaken screaming, drenched in sweat, only to find nothing amiss. Yet the psychic wounds would fester. Over weeks and months, sleep would become a place of terror, not rest. The vampire would feed on the resulting fear and despair, weakening their target's will until they were little more than a pliable, terrified puppet, easy to control and eventually consume. This power required no physical contact, no grand display of strength, only a deep, predatory understanding of the human psyche. Then there is the power of hemokinesis, the direct manipulation of blood. This is a rare and feared ability, even among the undead. A vampire possessing this gift can control blood not just within their own immortal veins, but within the bodies of others. With a mere thought, they can cause a victim's heart to stop, their arteries to rupture, or their blood to boil within them. Witnesses to such an event would see a person collapse in agony for no apparent reason, a perfect and untraceable method of assassination. Some legends claim these vampires could even draw blood out through the pores of the skin, creating a crimson mist around their victim as they fed from a distance. This power represents the vampire's ultimate mastery over their chosen sustenance. They are not just consumers of blood. They are its lords, its sculptors, able to wield the very fluid of life as a weapon of terrifying precision. Equally unsettling is the ability of corporeal mimicry. While many tales speak of vampires turning into bats or wolves, this is a far more deceptive power. A vampire with this ability can alter their physical form to perfectly replicate any human they have seen, or even consumed. They could replace a villager, a soldier, or even a trusted advisor, living among their prey for weeks or months. They would mimic the person's voice, their mannerisms, their memories, a perfect soulless copy. The imposter would use this guise to sow discord, learn secrets, and isolate its next meal. The horror of this power lies in the paranoia it creates. How could you know if your neighbor, your friend, or even your spouse was truly who they claimed to be? The discovery of such a deception was often too late. The original person long gone, their life stolen and worn like a mask by the creature that replaced them. Consider also the power of shadow animation. Certain vampiric bloodlines were said to have no shadow of their own, but they could command the shadows of others. In a candlelit room, a vampire could cause a person's shadow to writhe and contort independently, reaching out with dark, intangible claws. It could detach from the wall and move with a malevolent life of its own, a silent, two-dimensional predator. This was often used as a method of terror, driving a victim to the edge of sanity as their own shadow became their tormentor. But in the hands of a master, it was more. The animated shadow could interact with other shadows, snuffing out a candle flame by covering its dark counterpart, or even causing physical harm by striking the shadow of its victim, leaving bruises and welts on the real body. It was a power that turned a fundamental aspect of light and physics into a weapon of pure dread. In some maritime regions, from the fog-shrouded coasts of New England to the port cities of the Hanseatic League, sailors spoke of a different kind of vampire, one that commanded the mists. These fog drinkers could summon and shape dense fog, using it as a cloak to move unseen through city streets or across the decks of ships. They didn't just hide within the fog, they became one with it. Their physical form would dissipate into a chilling vapor, able to seep through keyholes, under doors, and through the smallest cracks in a ship's hull. Those caught within this supernatural mist would feel an unnatural cold drain their strength, their breath frosting in the air as the vampire in its ethereal form drew the warmth and life directly from their bodies. Survivors described a suffocating blindness, a sense of being watched from all directions at once, and a silent creeping death that left its victims pale and cold, as if they had frozen solid in the middle of a temperate night. There exists, as well, a peculiar resonance with the earth, a power known as geopsychic anchoring. This grants the vampire a profound connection to the soil of its homeland or a chosen territory. When standing on this ground, their powers are amplified to a terrifying degree. Their strength becomes legendary, their regenerative abilities nearly instantaneous, and their senses hyper-aware of every living thing within their domain. They become a genius loci, a spirit of the place. To fight them on their own ground is to fight the land itself. Roots might snake up to trip their pursuers. The very stones might shift to block a path of escape. This power, however, comes with a great vulnerability. The farther they travel from this anchored soil, the weaker they become, making them desperate to protect their territory and reluctant to ever leave. It explains why certain estates or ruins gain a reputation for being impenetrably evil. The creature within is intrinsically linked to the very dirt and stone of the place. Let us not forget the power of the feast of memories. For some ancient vampires, the act of drinking blood is not merely for sustenance, but for knowledge. With every drop of blood they consume, they absorb the memories, skills, and emotions of their victim. A vampire who feeds on a scholar gains their knowledge. One who feeds on a swordsman gains their martial prowess. This makes the oldest of them living libraries of stolen lives, possessing centuries of accumulated experience and expertise. They can speak forgotten languages, recall historical events with perfect clarity, and anticipate their opponent's moves by having lived 1,000 different lives. This power makes them incredibly cunning and adaptable. They are not just monsters of brute force, but master strategists, historians, and artists. Their minds a mosaic of all the souls they have consumed. Their charisma is not a simple glamour, but the distilled confidence of countless lifetimes of achievement. Another chilling power is that of decay acceleration. This is a passive, aura-like ability that emanates from certain particularly malevolent vampires. Their presence causes inanimate objects and organic matter around them to rot and decay at an accelerated rate. Fresh flowers will wilt and turn to dust in seconds. Wooden beams will crumble, and metal will rust before one's eyes. It is a physical manifestation of the spiritual corruption they represent. A house where such a creature lairs will quickly fall into ruin, covered in mold and decay that no amount of cleaning can stop. For a mortal, prolonged exposure to this aura is devastating. It ages them prematurely, their hair turning white, their skin wrinkling, their bodies becoming frail as if decades were passing in a matter of days. It is a slow, agonizing consumption, not of blood but of time itself, stealing the victim's future and leaving them a withered husk. Finally, there is the most enigmatic power, the manipulation of silence. While some vampires command shadows or beasts, these entities command the absence of sound. Within a certain radius of their presence, an unnatural silence falls. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, even the sound of a person's own heartbeat, all cease. It is not merely quiet. It is a heavy, pressing void that unnerves and disorients. Inside this sphere of silence, the vampire is the ultimate ambush predator. They move without a sound, their attacks coming with no warning. Victims report a sense of profound isolation and panic, as if the world itself has been erased around them. The vampire can also weaponize this silence, focusing it to deafen a target or to create a sound vacuum around a screaming victim, ensuring no one can hear their cries for help. This power turns one of our most basic senses against us, making silence, often a symbol of peace, into a harbinger of absolute terror. They don't just hunt in the dark, they bring the silence with them. This makes them utterly inescapable, for you cannot hear what is not there. You cannot detect an enemy whose very nature is to erase their own presence from the world. A footstep that makes no sound, a door that opens into a void of noise, a whisper that is felt as a cold spot on the back of the neck, but is never truly heard. It's an acoustic camouflage that renders them ghosts, even to the most vigilant of sentinels. And the accounts don't stop there. Across medieval Europe, an unusual pattern began to emerge in rural folklore, a chilling link between the undead and the animal kingdom. Villagers would whisper tales not just of strange figures seen at dusk, but of their four-legged and winged companions. These were not mere pets, but extensions of a darker will, acting as eyes, ears, and sometimes even enforcers. Take, for instance, the recurring tales from the forested regions of what is now Germany. A chronicle from the 15th century describes a village plagued by a wasting sickness. The afflicted grew pale, weak, and complained of a crushing weight on their chests at night. But the truly peculiar detail was the behavior of the local wolves. Normally reclusive, these packs began to patrol the village outskirts with an unnerving boldness. They wouldn't attack livestock or people directly. Instead, they seemed to stand guard, their howls echoing not with wild hunger but with a mournful, almost protective quality. Eyewitnesses claimed the wolves would gather on the hills overlooking the home of a newly afflicted person, their silhouettes stark against the moon, as if waiting for a signal or a command. When a group of brave villagers finally tracked the pack, the trail didn't lead to a den, but to an ancient, desecrated crypt on the edge of the forest. The wolves vanished into the gloom, and the men, losing their nerve, fled. Further south, in the alpine valleys of Italy, a different creature was implicated. Here the fear was of the striga, a nocturnal entity that preyed on the vitality of the living, but the harbinger of its presence was often a great horned owl. It was said that if this particular owl perched on your roof and hooted 3 times, it was a sign that the striga had marked your household. One farmer, having lost 2 children to the mysterious ailment, became maddened with grief and rage. He lay in wait one night, and when the owl landed on his barn, he fired his hunting rifle. The bird screeched and fell, but when the farmer ran to it, he found not a wounded animal, but a single large black feather lying next to a small pool of dark, viscous fluid that seemed to steam in the cool night air. That night, a reclusive old woman who lived on the edge of the village was found dead, a strange, bird-like wound in her chest. The connection was too uncanny to ignore. The concept of the familiar is an old one, but these accounts suggest something more profound, something more sinister than a mere magical servant. In coastal regions of France, tales spoke of swarms of rats that would precede a bout of inexplicable deaths. Not the common ship rats that brought plague, but unusually large, aggressive black rats that would appear from nowhere, infesting a specific home, only to vanish as suddenly as they arrived, leaving a drained, lifeless occupant behind. One account tells of a merchant who, upon returning from a long journey, found his home overrun. In a panic, he sealed the doors and set the building ablaze. Neighbors watched in horror as the rats swarmed from the flames, not scattering, but moving as a single writhing mass toward the old harbor district, disappearing into the shadows of a long-abandoned warehouse. And then there are the bats. Not the small, insect-eating bats common to the European countryside, but larger, more formidable specimens that were rarely seen. In Spain, legends of the vampiro were often accompanied by sightings of these creatures. A goat herd, seeking shelter from a sudden storm in a mountain cave, stumbled upon what he thought was a man sleeping, wrapped in a dark cloak. As he drew closer, he saw that the cloak was a colony of enormous bats, clinging to the figure in a dense, breathing shroud. They seemed to be feeding from him, or perhaps he was feeding from them. The line was blurred. The goat herd fled, and for the rest of his life, he swore that the man's eyes had opened in the darkness, glowing with the same faint red light as the myriad of smaller eyes that covered him. These creatures were more than just omens. They were participants. In some stories, a large black dog with glowing eyes would be seen leading a nocturnal predator back to its lair before sunrise. In others, a swarm of moths, so thick they could blot out a lantern's light, would descend upon a home, creating a screen of confusion and terror while the true attack took place. The animals were a living part of the vampire's ecology, an integrated system of predation. They were its spies, its decoys, its guardians, and sometimes its very form. The fear wasn't just of the monster in human shape, but of the entire natural world turning against you, its familiar creatures twisted into servants of an ancient hunger. The rustle in the leaves, the hoot of an owl, the howl of a distant wolf, any of these could be a prelude, a warning that you were no longer the master of your own domain. The true horror was the realization that the thing in the crypt did not sleep alone. It commanded a legion, and its sentinels were everywhere, watching from the branches, the shadows, and the sky. They were the first line of an ancient, creeping darkness, the silent partners in a pact written in blood. The village of Ardevon near the coast faced such a terror in 1688. It began not with a death, but with the disappearance of all the village cats. Over 3 nights, every single feline vanished without a trace. Then the dogs began to cower, whining and hiding, refusing to go out after dark. A week later, the first death occurred. A young woman found in her bed, pale as alabaster, with 2 small, almost invisible marks on her throat. The villagers, steeped in local lore, understood. The cats, natural enemies of the night's smaller servants, had been eliminated. The dogs, with their keen senses, knew a greater predator was walking among them. The animal kingdom had been silenced, its defenses dismantled in preparation for the master's hunt. The terror in Ardevon was not just of the unseen killer, but of the intelligent, methodical planning that preceded his arrival, a strategy executed by the very creatures they had once considered harmless neighbors. The silence of the night, once peaceful, had become a suffocating blanket of pure dread. The farmers began to notice their livestock, too, acting with profound fear. Horses would rear in their stalls at night, kicking at walls as if trying to break free. Cattle would low in terror, their eyes wide and white in the moonlight. One morning, a prize bull was found dead in its pen. Not a mark on it, but completely drained of blood, its massive body cold and strangely light. The perpetrator was not a wolf or a wildcat, No tracks were found save for those of a strange large moth that had settled on the barn door, its wings patterned like a human skull. As the deaths mounted, the villagers realized the entity was not just feeding on them, but on the life force of their entire community, its influence poisoning the land and every living thing on it. The very soil seemed to grow colder, the crops weaker. It was a holistic assault, where man and animal alike were simply livestock for an ancient, insatiable appetite, and the world itself was being remade into its personal larder. The animals weren't just messengers. They were the vanguard of this transformation, the first to fall under the shadow, their instincts corrupted and turned to the service of the thing that hunted their human masters. In a remote corner of Poland, near the Owl Mountains, a story circulates among the locals, spoken only in hushed tones. In 2007, a group of hikers exploring the abandoned network of tunnels from Project Rees vanished without a trace. The official search yielded nothing, but weeks later one of them, a young man named Jan, was found wandering on a forest road miles away. He was disoriented, anemic, and had 2 small, inexplicable puncture marks on his neck. He had no memory of the preceding weeks, only a recurring nightmare of being trapped in the dark, hearing a soft, rhythmic sound, and feeling a profound, life-draining cold. His companions were never seen again. Meanwhile, in the pastoral countryside of France's Auvergne region, a string of livestock deaths plagued farmers in 2011. Cattle were found completely drained of blood, yet there were no tracks of any known predator, and only minimal wounds on the animals. One night, a farmer named Luc decided to stand watch. He reported seeing a tall, gaunt figure move with unnatural speed across his field. It wasn't human, he insisted, but it wasn't an animal either. It moved with a chilling grace, and as it turned its head, Luke swore he saw its eyes gleam red in the faint moonlight before it disappeared into the shadows. The local gendarmerie dismissed it as a prank or an overactive imagination, but the attacks stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving the community terrified and bewildered. A more urban tale emerged from the old city of Prague in 2015. A university student researching medieval folklore in the city's ancient libraries began documenting a series of strange encounters in the Mala Strana district. She reported seeing a man, impeccably dressed in an old-fashioned style, who appeared night after night on the same quiet gas-lit street. He never spoke, but his intense, unblinking stare followed her. Her journal entries grew more erratic. She described feeling constantly watched, perpetually exhausted, and suffering from a strange wasting sickness that doctors couldn't diagnose. Her final entry simply read, "He promised me eternity. I feel so cold." She disappeared from her flat shortly after, leaving all her belongings, including the journal, behind. The case remains open. In the Scottish Highlands near Loch Assynt, a disturbing pattern of disappearances began in 2018. Solitary travelers and campers were the victims. The only clues left behind were neatly abandoned tents and gear, with food and valuables untouched. One recovered digital camera held the last photos taken by a missing German tourist. The final image, time-stamped just after midnight, was a blurry, frantic shot of the inside of his tent. In the corner of the frame, partially illuminated by the camera's flash, a pale, slender hand with unnaturally long fingers is seen pulling at the tent's zipper from the outside. The local constabulary has no suspects and no leads. The wilderness, they say, can be treacherous, but locals whisper of an old legend of a figure that haunts the loch, a lonely hunter who feeds not on the deer, but on the unwary who stray too far into the night. Further south, on a secluded island off the coast of Greece, a small, tight-knit community reported a strange phenomenon in 2021. The village's elders began to die off one by one. Each was found peacefully in their bed, but their bodies were described by the island's only doctor as withered, as if all the vitality had been drawn from them overnight. Superstition ran rampant. The villagers blamed a newcomer, a wealthy and reclusive artist who had bought an old cliffside villa. He was only ever seen after dusk, and his pallid complexion and strangely youthful appearance for a man of his reported age became the subject of fearful gossip. When a group of fishermen tried to confront him, they found the villa empty, looking as if it had been deserted for years, even though the artist had only been there for a few months. The deaths stopped. No official investigation ever found a cause beyond old age. But the villagers know what they believe. They barred the villa's doors and carved crosses into them, a silent testament to the visitor who brought a quiet, chilling plague to their shores. And in 2004, deep within Germany's Black Forest, a team of forestry workers stumbled upon a series of shallow, unmarked graves. The bodies were centuries old, yet some were remarkably preserved. More disturbing was that each skeleton had been pinned to the earth with iron stakes driven through the chest cavity. Forensic anthropologists were baffled. It was a burial practice not widely documented in that region, one associated with a deep-seated primitive fear. While examining the site, one of the researchers reported a strange encounter. Working late, he saw a figure standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing, motionless. He described it as tall and emaciated, its silhouette stark against the fading light. He called out, but it didn't respond. It simply watched him. Feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, he packed his equipment and left. When his team returned the next day, their excavation site had been disturbed. The ancient graves were filled back in with earth, and the iron stakes they had carefully removed were forcefully driven back into the ground. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. The forest had reclaimed its dead, guarding a secret that it seemed was never meant to be unearthed. The project was abandoned, the official report citing unstable ground conditions. In the labyrinthine back alleys of Venice, a city with a long and dark history, a series of baffling medical cases arose in 2019. Young, healthy individuals were admitted to hospitals with sudden, severe anemia and profound lethargy. They spoke of a charismatic stranger they had met at late-night carnivals and private parties, a person of intoxicating charm who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. They remembered intense conversations, a feeling of being completely captivated, but the details were hazy, like a dream. The only consistent physical finding was a small, almost invisible pair of marks on their skin, often on the wrist or neck, that doctors dismissed as insect bites or minor abrasions. All the patients eventually recovered, but they were left with a lingering sense of loss and a strange, melancholy longing for the mysterious figure they could barely recall. The medical community labeled it a localized psychosomatic event, a shared delusion. But for those who experienced it, the feeling of being drained, of having a piece of their very life force stolen, was undeniably real. In 2012, in the mountains of northern Italy, a monastery that had been abandoned for over a century was purchased for renovation. Workers clearing out the crypt made a gruesome discovery. Behind a false wall, they found a sealed alcove containing a single ornate sarcophagus. Inside lay the body of a 17th century nobleman, astonishingly preserved. He was dressed in finery, and a document found with him identified him as a count from a forgotten lineage. The church had sealed him there, the text claimed, because he would not stay in his grave. As the workers debated what to do, strange occurrences began. Tools would vanish, strange whispers echoed in the empty halls at night, and a palpable sense of cold dread permeated the monastery. One night, the foreman, staying late to guard the site, saw a tall shadow detach itself from the darkness of the crypt's entrance. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly terrifying. He fled the monastery and refused to return. The next morning, the sarcophagus was found open and empty. The nobleman's body was gone. The renovation project was halted indefinitely. Local authorities found no evidence of a break-in or theft, and the body of the count was never located. The monastery now stands empty once more, with a new and chilling chapter added to its history, a testament to the fact that some secrets are better left sealed in stone and forgotten by time. In the sprawling concrete jungles of our modern world, where millions of lives intersect daily, a chilling theory persists. It suggests that an ancient lineage, long thought to be the stuff of folklore, has not only survived but has adapted, thriving in the anonymity of our largest cities. They are unseen, unheard, and walk among us, their existence a closely guarded secret. Anonymous online forums and encrypted chat rooms are buzzing with hushed accounts. Users, identified only by cryptic handles, share unsettling stories of encounters in the urban labyrinth. A late-night commuter in Tokyo describes a figure on the subway platform, perfectly still amidst the swirling crowds, their face unnaturally pale under the fluorescent lights, their eyes seemingly devoid of reflection. The train doors opened and closed, but the figure never moved, just watched. The user reported feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill and a sense of being prey. In London, a security guard monitoring CCTV footage from a high-end financial district building speaks of an anomaly he can't explain. Night after night, a well-dressed individual would appear on camera feeds, moving through secured areas without triggering a single alarm. Their movements were fluid, impossibly fast, appearing as a blur between frames. When technicians reviewed the data, they found corrupted files and inexplicable gaps in the recordings, precisely at the times of the sightings. The guard, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "It's like they're ghosts in the machine, but they're real. I saw them with my own eyes." These aren't isolated incidents. Similar tales emerge from New York, Seoul, and São Paulo. A paramedic recounts a call to a luxury high-rise, finding a victim pale and weak, with 2 small, almost surgical punctures on their neck, dismissed by senior staff as an unusual insect bite. A freelance photographer captures a fleeting image in a crowded market, a face in the crowd that appears ageless, with an intensity in its gaze that feels ancient and predatory. When he tried to find the person again, they had vanished without a trace. Investigators who delve into these phenomena often hit dead ends. Witnesses become reluctant to speak, evidence disappears, and official reports are scrubbed or altered. There's a pattern of containment, a systematic suppression of information that suggests a powerful, coordinated effort to maintain secrecy. Some researchers theorize these beings have integrated themselves into the very fabric of society's power structures. They are the reclusive billionaires, the influential nightclub owners, the art dealers who only operate after sunset. Their wealth and influence grant them the ultimate camouflage. Consider the architecture of our cities. The vast, interconnected underground systems, subways, maintenance tunnels, forgotten Cold War-era bunkers, form a hidden world beneath our feet. Could these be the highways and havens for a population that shuns the sun? Reports from urban explorers or urbex enthusiasts occasionally surface describing strange markings on tunnel walls, areas that feel unnaturally cold, and the unnerving sensation of being watched from the shadows. One explorer's last garbled transmission from deep beneath Paris spoke of fast movers and eyes in the dark, before all contact was lost. The 21st century provides the perfect hunting ground. The gig economy, with its late-night food delivery and ride-sharing services, creates a constant, mobile source of unsuspecting individuals traversing the city at all hours. Dating apps allow for curated encounters, luring people to private, secluded locations with the promise of connection. The sheer, transient nature of urban populations means people can disappear without raising immediate alarm. A person moves to a new city for a job, loses touch with old friends, and their absence isn't noted for months, if ever. Proponents of this theory point to the existence of exclusive, high-end nightlife communities and clandestine societies. These are groups that operate almost entirely after dark, hosting lavish parties in undisclosed locations, accessible only by a secret invitation. Members are often described as charismatic, beautiful, and possessing an almost hypnotic charm. Outsiders who have managed to get a glimpse inside speak of an atmosphere of decadent danger, where the elite play by a different set of rules. Are these just clubs for the eccentric rich, or are they feeding grounds, cleverly disguised social gatherings for a hidden species? The digital age, while connecting us, also provides new methods of concealment. Sophisticated identity theft, hacked databases, and the creation of digital ghosts, fully fledged online personas with no real person behind them, allow these beings to exist on paper to own property, and to manage vast financial empires without ever stepping into the daylight. They can manipulate markets, influence media, and erase any trace of their activities with a few keystrokes, making them untouchable and virtually invisible to conventional investigation. There's the testimony of a former private security consultant who was hired for a contract he couldn't discuss. His job was to secure the penthouse of a reclusive tech mogul. The security measures were unlike anything he'd ever seen. The windows were layered with a material that blocked 100% of UV light. The ventilation systems had complex filters he didn't recognize, and the work schedule was strictly nocturnal. He never once met his employer in person, receiving all instructions through an encrypted terminal. The one time he accidentally saw a thermal scan of the penthouse, it registered multiple figures moving about, all of them reading at significantly below normal human body temperature. His contract was terminated the next day with a severance package so large it ensured his silence. Could it be that the myths were never myths at all, but rather historical accounts of a species that has simply perfected the art of camouflage? A species that has traded crumbling castles for glass towers and misty forests for the neon-drenched canyons of our cities. They don't wear capes or speak in dramatic accents. They wear designer clothes, trade stocks, and move silently through the digital and physical worlds we've built. They are predators who have evolved to hunt in the most target-rich environment imaginable, modern human society. They rely on our skepticism, our tendency to dismiss the extraordinary, and our absorption in our own busy lives. We look, but we don't see. We hear whispers, but we don't listen. The evidence, believers argue, is all around us, in the glitches of security footage, in the hushed stories of night shift workers, in the unexplained disappearances that become cold cases. They are hidden in plain sight, masters of the urban shadow, and their continued existence depends on one simple fact: we don't believe they are real. Perhaps the greatest trick they ever pulled was convincing the world they never existed in the first place, allowing them to thrive, unseen, in the heart of our civilization. The hunt, it seems, has never ended. It has just become more sophisticated. We have built the perfect ecosystem for them, a world of perpetual twilight and endless anonymity, where the lines between myth and reality blur into the darkness. The question is not whether they exist, but rather who among us knows the truth, and more terrifyingly, who among us is one of them. A city is a complex organism, and in its darkest veins, ancient things may still flow. The stories continue to be told in hushed tones, passed from one anonymous user to another, a digital folklore for a modern age warning of the predator that has adapted to our world so perfectly that we can no longer distinguish it from ourselves. The silence from the mainstream is not proof of their absence, but perhaps proof of their success.